Hi, my name is Jordan Olson. Today we'll be talking about whistleblowing, in particular the 7-step process on how to blow a whistle by Trevino and Nelson in the book Managing Business Ethics. We're relating those 7-step process to a Mr. Kurt Eschenwald's article called He Blew the Whistle and the Health Giants Quaked. In that article, Mr. Eschenwald talks about an individual called James Alderson, who was a chief financial officer for a health company in Montana. He worked for this company for a number of years, and the health company undergone some administrative changes due to a retirement of the chief administrator. In the process of this change, a Clyde Eder was introduced as the Quorum administrator. Quorum is the company that took over the health company that Mr. Alderson worked for previously. One day, Mr. Alderson and another employee were working on the cost report that they submit to the federal government for reimbursement programs like Medicare. Anyways, Clyde comes into the office and asks them if they're performing 2 cost reports. And Mr. Alderson's response was no, because they only need 1. And come to find out, the reason Clyde wanted them to perform 2 cost reports was one internal and one's a more aggressive cost report that they were going to submit to the federal government. If that cost report failed and was returned to them, they would submit the more appropriate, the one more realistic to actually what happened and the actual money they need to be reimbursed for. Well, Mr. Alderson didn't appreciate this. He wasn't going to do it. He told Clyde that he would not. And I don't know if it was weeks or months later, Mr. Alderson was invited to a manager training in Alaska. At that meeting, Clyde informed Mr. Alderson that he was let go, that he'd no longer be working for the company. Mr. Alderson then started pursuing a case of litigation against Quorum, where it took a number of years for them to complete the process. The process was pretty elaborate. Mr. Alderson spent a lot of time. In the article, it mentions that initially they thought it was going to take 60 days because that's the period in law where Mr. Alderson writes his lawsuit against the company, and the federal government has 60 days to accept that lawsuit and jump on board to process the health company. Anyways, that took more than 60 days. Actually, from the start to the day the federal government jumped on board was about 5 years. In that time, due to legal issues, the Aldersons had to keep quiet. They couldn't tell anybody what was going on. And the government eventually did jump on board, and they won the lawsuit against the health company Quorum, and found that they were fraudulently reporting cost reports to the federal government to get more money than they actually were actually supposed to be reimbursed. Now we're going to talk about the 7-step process and how Mr. Alderson followed how the 7-step process applied to Mr. Alderson. We'll find out and go through this that as we go through this that a number of the steps didn't apply to Mr. Alderson just because of the situation that he ended up in. The first step is approach your immediate manager. Obviously, the manager was Clyde, who asked him to perform 2 cost reports that they can submit to the federal government. one being the high over cost, I guess you could say. And then the next step is discuss the issue with your family. The third step is take it to the next level. The fourth step is approach your corporate ethics officer or ombudsman. The fifth one is to go outside the chain of command. The sixth one is go outside the company. And the seventh is leave the company. A number of these don't apply, as I mentioned earlier. And the first one obviously doesn't apply, as his manager was the one to ask him, so Mr. Alderson couldn't approach his manager about the issue. The second one, discuss it with your family. This one was very much applicable, as Mr. Alderson's wife and children knew exactly what was going on. Mrs. Alderson actually was in the car when Mr. Alderson took the subpoenas, the papers to the courthouse to submit the lawsuit. The third one, take it to the next level. In the book, it talks about going above your manager. I'm not really sure in the article if Mr. Alderson had, I assume that he did, that he had somebody above Clyde, but I think the time happened where he was fired shortly after he refused to do the 2 cost reports from Mr. Clyde, that it was hard for him or impossible for him to go above or take it to the next level above Mr. Clyde, who was his manager. The fourth step is talk to your corporate officer, your company's office ethics, or your ombudsman. As number 3, I mentioned that he didn't have enough time. That applies here as well, as he was let go and wouldn't have the chance to take it to his corporate ethics, his company's office, his company's ethics officer. There we go. And the 5th step, this step also doesn't apply for the same reason, because he didn't have enough time from the day he refused to do the report to the day he found out that he was being let go by the company. Now the 6th one, go outside the company, actually refers to this case where it talks about going to a regulatory body that the company falls under. Obviously, the health industry has a number of regulatory bodies that the health company has to abide with. So that's actually what Mr. Alderson did. He reported the issue and led to the litigation. The 7th step, leave the company. Obviously, Mr. Alderson was let go, so he left the company and no longer worked for the health company. Now we're going to wrap it up and introduce how all this applies, kind of go full circle. In the beginning of the How to Blow the Whistle by Trevino and Nilsson, it reads, let's assume that you're dealing with a serious issue. You've assembled the facts, they're accurate to the best of your knowledge, you've asked your peers or your manager for advice, and there's a law or company policy about the violation. Now what? What do you do? In the case of Mr. Alderson, he did exactly what he was supposed to do. He was let go. He refused to do the 2 cost reports, and which ended up leading to a $1 billion lawsuit against Quorum. There's an article that we've read by, I believe it's called, by a Mr. Barbador. Sorry if I slaughtered that one, but in there it says we don't need another hero, and I believe that Mr. Alderson did exactly what the We Don't Need Another Article or Another Hero article wrote, that Mr. Alderson went quietly, as I know a lot of it had to do with the whole process, that he was supposed to keep quiet and he couldn't tell his family what was going on. So that is exactly what happened. Mr. Alderson was very quiet. He didn't create a big uproar until the actual litigation happened. So both these articles apply to Mr. Alderson. I guess not the articles, but the Trevino's 7-step and Barbados article on We Don't Need Another Hero apply to Mr. Alderson pretty much to the point. And that's what I have for you today. And thanks for your time.